Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development, Episode 8, Season 2. Can't believe that. It's been a lot of fun doing this project. And actually, today we're going to have a visit from our first returning guest, who was also on the first episode we've ever done on this podcast. So I'll get to that in a minute. And we just spent a few episodes talking about the need for sustainable decarbonization and how to try to do it thoughtfully and intelligently and affect positive changes in very, very complex issues. But I thought it would also be wise now to step back a little bit and talk a little bit as to the need for actually why it's needed and where a lot of climate science starts. And that's actually the Arctic and why so much attention is paid to what happens thousands and thousands of miles away from most of us, and how that's messaged, and what actually most importantly we're seeing trending and how things are going and what those trends mean for all of us. Because again, all this is interconnected and it's easy to actually miss that fact. I first learned of the Arctic long ago. My first memory was probably watching a football game on television or something like that and seeing images of sad, hungry polar bears floating around on tiny ice and thinking to myself, oh God, that's horrible, but what's it mean for me and why are they showing me this and what can we do about it? And frankly, for a lot of people, I think that same image is still in their head, as well as the same uncertainty as to how to move forward. So, on that point, we're going to bring a couple of people on today to give some answers, tell us how things have been going, and why, frankly, it's so absolutely critical that attention is paid to this part of the world. So, in no particular order, today we have Marisol Maddox and Zach Labe. If you can both please come on, please. Afternoon, how are you?
Great, thanks. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anyone who watches the show will probably actually remember Marisol, but Marisol, if you want to start and give, I don't know, a couple minutes as to why you chose to get into this type of work.
Yeah, so it was really in working in a completely different field, working close to the land and spending a lot of time with people who were spending a lot of time with the land, you and the sea. You really notice those changes in the environment faster when you're really paying attention. And you notice those subtle changes and then the not so subtle changes. And so, in basically looking at the scientific literature around climate change and seeing that things would really be changing, I actually initially started thinking about climate risk from a homeland security perspective because of, anticipating challenges around water management. Around, if you look at Mendel's hierarchy of needs, you need food security, water security, shelter, or these kind of basic needs in order to then say, okay, and now I'm going to start a business and contribute to the economy. And so if we're having those fundamental needs challenged by this new era of disruption from a homeland security perspective, that seemed like a pretty important dimension of risk to be accounting for. And, this was back in 2010, 2011, when I really started thinking about this, and seeing that we were so focused on counterterrorism, for obvious reasons. And it's not that that's not a threat, that is, but we have to not be afraid to widen the aperture in an appropriate manner to understand when we're talking threats to the homeland, what are those things that are going to impact Americans, and not letting politics or kind of an obfuscation of facts or science get in the way of having really clear-headed analysis, because our people deserve that.
No, absolutely. I think that's really important. And that objective analysis point, if anyone hasn't already done so, go back a few years and read what the Department of Defense and Department of Interior and other correlated cabinet positions have said about climate change and the potential impacts they're going to have. and just how they look at these things. But actually, before we get over to Zach, can you just also, because I didn't do this in the introduction, give like 30 seconds on to actually where you're working now and maybe how you got there?
So currently, I'm a senior Arctic fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies at the Dickey Center at Dartmouth College, and I'm also a senior associate non-resident at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC as part of their Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. So I've taken that initial work of looking at climate risk and I've pivoted that to a specialty in the Arctic because it is changing faster than anywhere on Earth, as we will get into today. And it has tremendous implications for US homeland security, national security, and international security.
Awesome. And I think I told you this last time we chatted, but we have something in common there because my older sister Heather actually graduated SICE as well, so I know the school kind of well. So pretty cool. Zach?
Yeah, sure. So I am a climate scientist at Climate Central. So we really work on trying to understand climate change, changes to extreme weather, and also communicating that information. And we really focus on communicating at local scales. How does all these climate risk impact people? So that's the current work I do. But I got my start originally in the Arctic in grad school. And to go way back, I feel very lucky that I've always known what I wanted to do, and that was become a meteorologist. I don't know why, but even as a kid, I was fascinated with the weather and admittedly had really no exposure to climate change until I went to college. And they always say, in college, try something new for your career, see how it goes. So one summer I reached out to a professor and asked if I could do research on climate science. And, that ever since then has really changed my career. So I went to grad school thinking about, connecting my interests in the weather to climate change. And I realized that the Arctic in particular is, as we keep saying over and over again, is one of the fastest changing places in the world. In fact, the science is changing so quickly by the time I've heard examples, someone is studying, let's say, a glacier, and by the end of their PhD, when they defend, the glacier's gone. I mean, in some cases, that is the rate of change. So we need more research on this topic. We need more data. And I felt that this was a place I could really make a difference and sort of found my way into thinking about particularly changes in the Arctic and how it impacts the weather elsewhere around the world. And in addition to that, I really spent a lot of time thinking about science communication. During grad school, I was frustrated, I think, with admittedly the figures and visualizations being used in a lot of scientific research and communication to communicate what is happening in this area. And thought, I'm no expert in communication or visualization, but let me try to see if I can make this more accessible to broader audiences. And ever since then, communicating the science in addition to my research has been a really important part of my job.
I'll just also note that in the time it was first us chatting about doing this episode till filming this today, we actually saw a glacier in Europe collapse and bury a town. So can't get more real and unfortunate and horrible than that. But I'm going to start with a little bit of a softball, I guess, to you guys. Why does climate science, I think you both touched on this a little bit, why does climate science begin and focus so much on the Arctic?
So the Arctic is, I like to think of it as really this early warning indicator of climate change around our planet. So we know it's this really rapidly changing place, but it's also one of the key indicators of human-caused climate change. I think one of the most shared graphs in climate science is changes in the amount of Arctic sea ice, which is just going downward of time. And this was one of the first real clues going a couple decades ago that we're starting now to see the impacts of climate change. And so there's been a lot of focus on understanding this rapid change, how it impacts climate change elsewhere around the planet. So I think a lot of people look to the Arctic to really understand sort of the broader climate science and change topics we work on.
I
So,
think Zach summed that up really well, which is not shocking at all. Um, and yeah, I think, just to kind of elaborate a little bit, you see that there is this growing recognition, especially as there has been an advancement of I guess what I would call like attribution science in terms of being able to directly link changes in specific parts of the Arctic to phenomena that we see in other parts of the world. And so, this is where we're seeing like the one of the main drivers of India's interest in really starting to fund more Arctic research is because of their concerns about how Arctic change will affect their monsoon precipitation.
No, I agree. That makes sense. And I had asked Zach actually to prepare a few things for today because I kind of jokingly call him the wizard of visuals and variations of that. But I said during my introduction, Zach, that my first thought of the Arctic was going back to that ad I saw on television of the starving polar bear on ice. I mean, it must have been, I don't know, late 80s or something like that. So can you give us a quick overview and dazzle us a little bit with your wizardry as to how things have been trending since that time?
Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay. I'll try not to turn this into a talks. But yes, as has been said and hinted around multiple times, I love visualization as a really, as I'm saying a couple times, powerful way of storytelling. And so I think I've shown this picture right now in every single one of my talks I've ever given about the Arctic. And I intentionally like leave no labels, there's no jargon, it's just pictures. And so then I give some clues, and what you're looking at is little maps of the Arctic looking downward at the North Pole. And what I really like about this is I want people's eyes to really think about the colors you're seeing. So, if you look at the top maps, you're seeing some blues and reds, but then at the bottom, you're looking at mostly reds. And then I slowly add on some labels. So after you've perceived, these colors and what they might mean, then I show that this is actually showing temperature departures compared to average for the last 40 some years where we have satellite observations. So this really shows that, anywhere that's red is warmer than average and blue is colder than average. So we can clearly see that it's becoming a lot more red. The Arctic is really warming up. And, we'll probably refer to this term many times as polar amplification, this really accelerated warming of the Arctic. And I think, when we think about the Arctic warming, it's important to keep in mind it's not just the air and atmosphere that's warming, but the ocean is warming. So on the right hand side shows, the ocean warming, and the middle shows the sea ice declining, and it's all of these in like the entire Earth system interacting with one another that causes this rapid acceleration. And here's another just visualization showing really what's going on to set our stage for our conversation today. And here's a animation of the amount of thickness and the volume of the ice that's going down over time. And then, we have people in climate science who also study past climate going back thousands of years. So we can visualize that. So this is like a graphic of sea ice changing over the last almost 2,000 years. So we can see on the right-hand side is the recent where we are today in that red dashed line. And clearly the decline that we're experiencing today is, unprecedented in our historical and reconstructed record. And also, it's not just sea ice changing, it's not just the ocean warming, but we also are having impacts to Greenland. The Greenland ice sheet is declining. So here's actually comparing side by side the loss of land ice on both Antarctica and in the Greenland ice sheet going over the last couple decades. So you can see they're both declining, but we're seeing a particularly significant loss on Greenland. And if that has major implications for sea level rise. So it's also not just the ice sheet that's declining, but our glaciers across the Arctic are also losing the amount of ice. So we can see here just a visual of how much and how quickly the loss of glaciers is accelerating around the world. And that all leads to sea level rise, major implications for coastal communities all around our planet. And it's not just flooding when a storm hits, but it's flooding during high tides. They have this phenomenon called sunny day flooding, where it's a sunny day, a high tide, and the water is now coming into, let's say, Miami, into communities where it never did before. And I think I'll, just want to show one more of like where we're going. So everything I've shown in these visuals is like clear pictures of what's happening now in the Arctic. But what does it look like going forward into the future? And a lot of this, the answer to this is based on us. It's decisions, policy decisions that we make depending on how much fossil fuels are emitted. So this graphic is showing, these different types of emission scenarios going forward into the future for the entire planet as it spins around. But of course, there's that real amplified blob of red on the top of our planet. That's the Arctic, and has so many, of course, far-reaching effects. And I think also I'll point out in the top left one is showing a world without humans. So a natural climate change, and you can see that the red doesn't show up there. And I think my whole way of thinking about both my research and communication is how can we take this complex science, often this jargon and just tons of numbers, and how can we turn that into visualizations that can reach all audiences? And it's taken me some time to think of it as storytelling, but now I very much think it's a different and powerful way to sort of communicate change.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was great. Um, a lot of questions, but the first one that comes to my mind, because I'm doing this episode as a follow-up to a couple of episodes we did in series to talk about what it would take to decarbonize the electric grid in our country, in the United States, and the myriad of hurdles in front of it, and the fact that all these projects takes time. So you have to think to yourself, okay, you're not going to get better on this warming graph for a considerable amount of time, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons. And I think you just illustrated pretty well that that lag has actual consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. The decisions, we're making today, have a long way down the road to see impact, particularly for something like sea level rise and the Greenland ice sheet. The seas will continue to rise. Timing is urgent in any topic we talk about climate change related, but I think it's particularly urgent for such a sensitive region like within the Arctic.
No, I agree with everything you just said there. And you also really threaded the needle there pretty well because it is such a daunting, frankly depressing at times challenge there. But you have to try and end that hope or find the hope to get to some type of objective path forward that actually improves things a little bit. I was just thinking too, as you were speaking about how this is a global issue, I hear cynicism, again, going back to what you said before, about whether or not individual actions move a needle or even country level actions will move a needle on such a global problem.
Well, I mean, I'll just add on this, and then I think I would love to hear from Zach too about in terms of the science, what the science tells us about the reasons to be hopeful, right? And I think I know that you can speak to that very well. Um, oh wait, sorry, but what was the other aspect of what you just said? Sorry.
It's okay. I was
Um,
asking if actions on individual level or even individual country level can
right.
actually move a
Thank you.
needle.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So I would say, like, so we need to be taking the policy side of climate action very seriously because we need to be, changing the incentives, right? So even if it has to do with subsidies for really harmful fishing practices or the ways in which we distort the global economy to do certain things, we need to be pushing those economic distortions towards a livable future. And so, that's something where I think we need to be really maintaining that focus on international cooperation. But at the personal level, more and more individual actions do matter because they build culture. And this is something that is changing really quickly. And there's two things in particular: intensive computing through artificial intelligence, the proliferation of artificial intelligence, as well as cryptocurrency. So, like, I will not use cryptocurrency. I will not use AI unless it's for something that really can justify intensive computing. Because at this point, we're actually at a point culturally where we're starting to normalize the very casual use of intensive computing, which has real world consequences. But there seems to be an incredible disconnect between the way that people will use AI essentially for shits and giggles, that without recognizing that this is completely blowing the energy transition out of the water,
Yep.
right? The electrification, that that demand on the grid, the way that they're having to use, not just nuclear, but having to keep, all fossil energy facilities open now to be able to fuel this, right? So, I mean, AI is something that exists. It's a part of the world that we live in. There are absolutely ways in which it needs to be used, but culturally, this is where I think individuals, and the evidence shows individuals all will have a huge impact. And just in having those conversations with each other, and just, we need to evolve culturally in a way that recognizes that humans are linked to the rest of the natural world, that we're not separate from it. And we need that more and more through example as we're really culturally going off into this bizarre land that is not at all linked to the real planetary boundaries that actually constrain us.
No, I think that's right. And I started off actually the first podcast we did with Marisol and also Andy Bachman talking about the interconnectedness of all things and the fact that a change at the top of the system messing with the climate filters down to affect 1,000 things under it. And as you're talking there, Marisol, I'm thinking to myself of all my friends that I know who use artificial intelligence for their LinkedIn posts. So that's basically where we've gotten. But Zach, if you want to talk about where we can find hope in the science.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a challenge, as has been mentioned, is the cynicism. I give this talk about Arctic climate change dozens of times per year, and it's, as the visuals show, dramatic change. There goes the ice, there goes the warming. And, so for the longest time, I struggled, giving a climate change talk. You don't want to end on this doom and gloom. And so I remember this was back, I think, during the COVID times that Ginger Z had this show or series called "It's Not Too Late," and I really liked this saying "It's not too late," and have since added it to my talks, and then show the science about it's not too late. Thinking about our choices matter in the future, and so admittedly, my climate science research is not done out in the Arctic. I'm a computer modeler, so I sit behind a computer all day. But I like to say that even so, I still have I don't have like a chemistry laboratory like some scientists, but my computer is my laboratory and I can conduct experiments with it. So in the science world, we can run climate model simulations, making these different scenarios going forward into the future. And so we can see how the Arctic responds. And one of the biggest questions, we all get is when or will the Arctic have an ice-free summer? And so we can run, many different types of simulations to try to understand the timing of this and the uncertainty. And we can see that if, there are dramatic reductions in, we make decisions to clean up, fossil fuel emissions and greenhouse gases, that there is a much more reduced chance of an ice-free Arctic, and that in some extreme scenarios, if we got started tomorrow, it can still be avoided. And so I have this visualization and it says it's not too late and shows that, we can still actually have time to make decisions, that the ice doesn't completely disappear in the summer in the Arctic.
And I think it's important to note too that the largest demographic of folks around the world who listen to this podcast is actually young people, students, undergrad, graduate, and there's also a good correlation there between generally younger people having m more import behind having to do something on climate change and thinking this is an urgent issue, have to act, pay the attention it deserves. Um, I want to go back to something you said before, Zach. You spent a lot of time talking about the potential and unfortunately likelihood of sea level rise and flooding associated with melting ice. What are some other impacts of changes in the Arctic that, say, hypothetically, I would see in the United States or someone in Europe, um, from, I don't know, changing weather patterns to wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Marisol touched on this point briefly about the connections with India. They're interested in the Arctic for potentially impacting the monsoon. So I think one of the most exciting and active areas of scientific research is understanding these linkages between Arctic change and weather, we say lower latitudes across, um, parts of North America, Asia, Europe, trying to make these connections. And the answer is tricky. There is not a clear, one-to-one. We understand it, but there's papers and research coming out every day. There was one earlier this week connecting Arctic change to more stagnant heat waves during summertime across the northern hemisphere. So this is a really active area of work trying to understand you have this rapid change at one part of the planet. How does it affect the rest of the planet? And there's the way I, in most simplest terms, explain this is that the Arctic is really our planet's refrigerator at the top of our planet. It sort of helps to cool and maintain Earth's temperature at these habitable levels. And so if you start reducing the efficiency of our refrigerator, that will have, carry on impacts. The Arctic amplifies change. It amplifies change in the atmosphere and the ocean. So we often, talk about atmospheric effects are over land, but the ocean is dramatically changing too. And another example I like to give is that there was a show. Admittedly, I don't. I should look up if this TV show is still on, called The Deadliest Catch. It was about crabbing in the North Pacific. And they went up to a region in the Bering Sea, which is located between Russia and Alaska, and to get crab. And that is an area that just a couple winters ago in 2018 and 2019 usually would have sea ice come down in the Bering Sea, but those 2 winters in a row, there was like no ice. In fact, it was retreating in the middle of the winter time northward. And so that has major implications for fisheries in the North Pacific Ocean. And this, uh, during that follow-on year in that season, essentially where the crab used to be, were not there. They moved. We're seeing a northward migration of ocean mammals and fisheries, and that's going to impact you at the grocery store to go buy seafood. You'll see the price of seafood increase, and it all the way connects back to the Arctic. So there's many of these like connections and linkages that impact our daily life that are not too obvious, but they all point back to the Arctic.
And I have to admit, as soon as you said Deadliest Catch, I don't know why, but I just got really, really happy because I was obsessed with that show for like 5 years. Marisol, how about other impacts we might not be thinking about immediately?
Yeah, so the Pacific Northwest National Lab, PNNL, they did a really great little, like, very short video explainer talking about the link between Arctic sea ice decline and the expanding wildfire season in California. And so I highly recommend folks go to YouTube and check that out. Because it's just a very simple overview of exactly what Zach was just talking about. And then, the wildland fire issue is one that we're very concerned about in the Arctic and globally because the permafrost, which makes up about 15% of the northern hemisphere, is thawing. And it's releasing a lot of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, including a lot of methane. And this is really not accounted for in our carbon budget, and it's barely accounted for in our climate models, only in a very linear, gradual way. And so, as we're getting with the increase of climate change, what that has meant is more extremes like prolonged droughts and then more extreme temperatures. And then also in Alaska, we've had a lot more lightning as well. But so the wildfire season has become really serious. In Russia, we've already seen years where they've had over 55 million acres burn. And a couple years ago, during a horrible wildfire season in Canada, it was about 40 million acres that burnt. And many parts of the lower 48 in the continental US experienced that through that really severe haze,
Yep.
right? And so, but the projections looking out are that if we do not take forest management more seriously and address the climate risk issue, that we are going to start seeing some of those 55 plus million acre years and then increasing. And already the Canadian wildfire season's off to a really bad start. I'm very concerned about it. Again, like these abrupt thaw events are not accounted for in our modeling and in our carbon budget. So, in terms of being able to understand how much are we going to warm within what period, what does a policy have to aspire to achieve in order to reduce emissions and sequester carbon in an evidence-based way to limit the amount of warming that we experience. We need to have the most accurate accounting as possible, but then we also need to have the commensurate action. So I would say that the wildland fire issue is one that is, really acute. It affects the people of the Arctic. This is also an area that's really important for continental defense for the United States. So, Clear Space Base in Alaska was on, it was basically on orders to be ready to evacuate at any moment because of a severe wildfire in Alaska, right? So you're having this intersection of a really complicated international security situation in a very conventional sense, and then you add climate change on top of it, and you see that the risk landscape is really changing. And so we have to understand that, again, going back to basics of like, what does it mean to think about security? We really need to be understanding all of the factors that bear upon security, and then how do we as a global community work together to mitigate that risk? Because this is something that can really get out of hand if we don't act urgently.
On the other side of the coin, though, couldn't the cynic or the opportunist see melting ice and wider trade channels and access to natural resources that they didn't have before as an economic opportunity and something to actually embrace?
Yeah, I think that's part of the cynicism that I referenced earlier, is that in some ways, I think that as people are starting to realize how serious our current circumstances are, and how much it's going to take to get in front of this, that in some ways it actually risks accelerating dynamics that are incredibly destructive because people can think, oh, well, we're not going to be able to do this, so I need to just benefit as much as I can in the near term so that my family is as well positioned as possible to deal with the world when things collapse, right? And that's a really like terrible dynamic. And it's not even actually logical if you play out that thought train. The only hope that we have is that we can actually muster the ability to cooperate and take this very seriously. Because even if you are, an incredibly wealthy individual and you have profited a bunch and you have your bunker and you have your virtual reality headset for your kids. And I mean, we have to go back to real basic like philosophical questions like, what does it mean to be a happy and healthy person, right? If you can just, pump somebody full of drugs and give them a virtual reality headset so they think that they're living in a beautiful world and they're really in a basement the whole time and they have all these little chatbot friends, is that success? Is that a life well lived? I actually think we need to be asking these questions because it seems like a lot of these dominant dynamics are pushing us into a direction that is saying that it's okay to substitute a completely synthetic reality for the world that we live in when the world that we are in needs our attention and our presence more than ever. And so again, like it does go back to that, the culture piece and the individual action piece, where at this point, we really do, as individuals, need to decide how we want to engage in this world. And at this point, it really is an act of resistance to be saying like, no, I want to be present in the world. I want to go outside and listen to the birds singing, right? Or I want to pay attention. I want to look at the insects that I see outside and like marvel at the colors that I see. Because at this point, we're really going in a direction that is extremely concerning to me, where it's the culture of distraction, right? And then you don't even notice that things are degrading so much. And that's not, I can absolutely guarantee you, we don't need the data to back it up. That's not going to be a world that we want to be in.
Absolutely agree with that. And it's something we've touched on a little bit to this point, but I was going to get to next anyway. Biodiversity loss and the fact that as humans, we are naturally supposed to be connected to nature. Enjoy some of the things you just talked about, get the benefits health-wise from nature, but in a balance. What does it look like? And you just touched on this a little bit, Marisol, when that's not the case, or when, or how about this? I'll say it another way. If those graphs that Zach gave earlier keep going as poorly as they are, what does that mean for biodiversity loss?
So, I mean, we are connected and a part of the natural world, whether or not we want to recognize that, right? And so that is an intractable truth. Um, we've been able to kind of distort things, right? Where like you turn on a tap and you don't have to know what river supplies your water, because we facilitated this kind of separation, right? And I mean, even with like, nutrients, right? Like the waste that humans produce, we think of it as, waste management as opposed to like fertility, right?
Mm.
If you look at some of these traditional cultures, in indigenous communities, they would use everything because, that waste is actually fertility if you manage it correctly. It becomes a waste management problem when it's not managed in that way,
Mm.
right? And so it's really, I think that we would benefit from just reconnecting to the ways that we are inherently connected, because we also have an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And if you understand that you are actually connected to everything, and that if you look at a person, you look at your microbiome and you look at the number of bacteria and fungi and all sorts of amazing life that makes your life possible, it helps to facilitate that kind of approach towards the world that is based in gratitude and appreciation. And that's a much healthier place to come from than something that's based in entitlement, right? Or this idea of superiority. Um, and so it's really, I think that connecting back to our inherent interconnectivity with life on Earth is not only a gift to the world because the world needs our engagement. It's really a gift to ourselves because it's a reminder that you're not alone, you are connected, and that then based off of this idea of understanding like who are your neighbors, right? Not just humans, but the animals, and what are their needs. You just pay more attention, you feel more connected. Um, so there's just so much value in that. I guess then looking at the trajectory that we're on, of course, it's horrific, right? I mean, and it's really unacceptable, because it's completely unnecessary for for all of this just trauma and grief and like death to be playing out, right? Like that. I really hope that that's not the trajectory that we continue to be on, but it's going to take a very purposeful redirection in our own personal lives, in our communities, what Zach was talking about with talking to people, just normalizing, these discussions, not just about climate, but also about wildlife and our relationship to the natural world and to each other, learning about local foods and, the indigenous peoples who traditionally inhabited the lands. There's ways in which, empowering them to have greater stewardship ability over the land again will have tremendous benefit for biodiversity, right? Like the vast majority of biodiversity that still is around is on indigenous managed lands. So that's a really important part of the policy conversation is how do we empower these communities, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But one of the aspects of Arctic work that I really appreciate because the indigenous peoples are just incredibly powerful and influential in Arctic policy.
Absolutely, and they're a wealth of knowledge for a lot of reasons, but there are also examples from around the world about how indigenous knowledge actually informs climate planning, climate resiliency for large towns and cities. Zach, I'm wondering if you have any follow-up to what Marisol said.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to take this word interconnectedness and bring it to science world. And in my personal view, the best science is not done in isolation. It's done collectively, not just in one country, but all of us together to solve problems. And it also requires people from all sorts of different areas of expertise working together. So the Arctic is this rapidly changing place in the physical climate space, but it's this challenging place for security, for economics, for political interests, for thinking about indigenous peoples and communities and ecosystems. So there's all these things happening that make it such a unique place to try to understand. And I think I want to give an example of what I think is a tremendous success in the scientific world is through this annual report that's produced called the Arctic Report Card. And it comes out every single year in the month of December. And essentially it's dozens of scientists, maybe over 100 scientists from tens of countries all over the world working together across all different fields to understand changes in the Arctic. And in essence, a report card. It doesn't provide, let's say, a grade, but it provides sort of this monitoring for each component of the Arctic. And I think we're going on now, its 20th anniversary this year. And so you can look back at the very first Arctic report card compared to what it is today and see the dramatic change. But I think to get back to this, what we were describing, one of the things that the Arctic report card is really putting an emphasis, and I think it does some of the best work. And for me, I'm less interested in my chapter, which is on sea surface temperature, and more interested in these unique chapters. So each year they pick different themes, and they often incorporate an indigenous essay too to provide their perspective and their knowledge on the changing Arctic and what they're observing. And then they have these other chapters with other unique topics that go back to what we were talking about in nature. And so I think I learned so much from whatever different one of these themes that get picked from year to year. It's ranged from topics anywhere from like Arctic pollinators to different shrubs to caribou to walrus and any topic you could possibly think of. And they focused on an Arctic perspective. And way back in the conversation, you mentioned, some people think maybe opportunistically, the less sea ice, now I can ship through the Arctic, these shipping lanes, cut my time in half, have to go from the Atlantic Pacific. And the Arctic Report Card has done some really interesting chapters in recent years on some of the consequences, unforeseen consequences of things like increased Arctic shipping, about its connections to nature. And one of them I never would have thought about was changes to acoustic sound in water. So now you have all this noise from ships coming through the Arctic that is completely disrupting marine animals that rely on, I'm no biologist, marine biologist, but they rely on sounds for the migratory patterns. And now it's been completely disrupted. The Arctic Ocean is now this incredibly noisy place underwater from an increase in shipping. So there was an entire chapter talking about changes to marine sound. There was another chapter about Arctic marine debris. So now with increasing shippings, we're seeing more debris. And there was a case, I forget which year it was, where this massive amounts of debris washed up on one of the islands in the Arctic Ocean. I mean, the most obscure, strange things must have fallen off some of the boats that wound up in this huge debris pile of trash. I mean, giant items washed up on shore in this event. So there's all of these unforeseen consequences from some of these opportunistic, perspectives. There's also the concern about, what if something goes wrong? Just because there's less ice doesn't mean there's no ice. And so You have cases where ships now they are, don't have the stronger hull going up into the Arctic, thinking that, there's no ice or the ice is very thin and they can go right through. And then they find because the ice is thinner and it's more fragile, it's also more mobile. So you can have the ice moving around a lot quicker, it can hit each other, causing these rifts. And so that's a whole security, threat and safety risk. We're also seeing tourism. And one example of an actual picture I use in talk is of a cruise ship, a huge one going into the Arctic Ocean, and a polar bear is right next to it. But the real concern is there is, if something happens to these ships that are going through, there's no one close by for easy access for safety, concerns and for emergency situations. You're isolated up there. So anyway, in this Arctic report card, it covers the physical consequences of change and all of these unique topics that I think connect to this interconnectedness we were just discussing.
Interesting, interesting. I know we have a hard stop coming up here in about 15 minutes. So there's one more major topic I wanted to address before final thoughts. There have been a lot of changes in our country, United States, over the last five months or so, shifting priorities from climate change to science, from environmental justice research, what I do. I wonder if you can both speak for a little bit about whether or not your work has gotten more complicated or you've seen unnecessary hurdles, for lack of a better term, with the changes that have happened recently.
Yeah, I think in my own work, we're having a lot of challenges. The Arctic is also a hard place to get to, which means we don't have many observations. So we need more observations and more data and more resources to support field work of, icebreakers going into the Arctic. And all of these currently are being cut or threatened to be eliminated due to lots of uncertainty. So that's all a giant challenge. If you look at some of the budgets for certain agencies, and some of them, the polar science, wing of it has actually had some of the largest cuts to supporting new and scientific research. So there's so many challenges. We could have a whole podcast about what's happening to threats to polar science research and our ability to monitor these changes in real time, which then affect our ability to try to plan for the future. So that's connected as well. And I think my last point I want to hit on is the threat to early career science. I mean, I'm biased as an early career scientist, but truthfully, early career scientists are really at risk right now. They're losing their positions, loss of grants and funding, and I'm already hearing, anecdotally, just from my own close network of many people considering careers outside of science, taking their skills in research and translating them to data science, computer science, and so it feels like we're really at a tipping point for losing our entire next generation of Arctic researchers to take on this giant problem that isn't going away anytime soon. So yeah, very much at risk.
Thank you, Marisol.
Yeah, so before I was at CSIS, I was actually at the Polar Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the Polar Institute was closed by Doge. The Wilson Center has been largely gutted. There's five people left, so vast majority of people lost their jobs, and there doesn't seem to be a great understanding that the Wilson Center was Congress's think tank. So, I had a bunch of open inquiries from all parts of US government that are just looking for a nonpartisan subject matter expert to talk about, different parts of the world as they're trying to formulate policy and think through policy. And that was a place that they could call up and, reliably have, a voice that wasn't, influenced by anything partisan or, any other agenda, because it was the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. So I think that is really, a loss for our country. And, policymakers posing, supposedly, representing the American people, they really should have access to that expertise as they're thinking through, some pretty critical issues. But yeah, I mean, I guess Zach said, summed it up great in terms of the concerns about science. I'm very concerned about the brain drain from our country. We're seeing a
Me
lot
too.
of other countries that are saying, "Oh, well, we'll fund this and we'll take American scientists." And some of them are going to some other, countries that are allies of ours, which I'm like, well, they need to have a job, and if they're going to not be in the U.S., I'd rather they go, somewhere like Denmark or to one of our allies. But there's also, China and some other countries that are looking to really just prey upon U.S. talent, U.S. discontent
Mm.
with a lot of the ways that federal workers have been treated. It really creates some pretty serious dynamics for the U.S. So I'm very concerned about that, and really just pretty baffled at the extent of the politicization of climate and science in general, and just expertise. This is something where, if we're thinking about, the US's best interests, it's really important to have experts to be able to present context for different dynamics that are playing out, or to help explore options. And that, like my work at the Polar Institute was never partisan, right? I worked with the Trump administration the first time around, worked with people in the Biden administration, and then was ready to be supporting the Trump administration again, just with providing that, subject matter expertise. So it's really something that I'm very concerned about.
And yeah, I like how Zach referred to it as a tipping point because unfortunately, a lot of the topics we talk about associated with the Arctic refer back to climate tipping points. And I think that's how we spent a lot of the first episode, in fact. But the perhaps unintended consequences can still cause tipping points that have real tangible impacts and affect people's everyday lives and have us not be ready to make the important policy choices we have to make, frankly, and that we aren't going to be able to avoid going forward. We're starting to come up on time a little bit, so I want to give you guys both time for some final thoughts. I like to always try to end on a hopeful note as well. So if you can keep that demographic of young people, college age, possibly just getting your first job, who might want to go into the climate sciences, study the Arctic, is there anything you want to tell them?
Yeah, I'll say to always, remember science is cool. This is really great work. I feel so lucky, I think, as I said earlier, to work in a career where I feel so much passion. Every day is a new challenge, it's new excitement. I get to do so many things. And, scientific careers, it's not just sitting behind a computer. I do things like this, podcasts, or I go to elementary schools and talk about science. Every day it's a whole new component. And I feel like it's such a unique career when I talk to people, not in this area. So I think to my, talk about how fun science is, how cool it is, the types of different careers that it can take you, if you're interested in the Arctic or climate change. Climate change it's every part of our lives. Every career in every industry is being impacted in climate, and you can find a connection if you want to work on this problem in any single industry. It's not going away. Despite some challenges and uncertainties we're in now, the overall problem isn't going away. So I would encourage, students to seek out, chat. I'm always happy to talk about careers in climate, to brainstorm new ideas. I, I would continue to follow your passions in this space.
Yeah, so from a policy perspective, I would say the Arctic Council, which is the premier intergovernmental forum for cooperation in the Arctic region. The Arctic Council, went through a really challenging period with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and is obviously still dealing with those challenges. And with the change in administration, in the United States, there was a lot of concern about the way that the U.S. has previously blocked climate language. But I I do find hope in the fact that the chairship of the Arctic Council was able to transfer from Norway to the Kingdom of Denmark, led by Greenland in May. And the US seems to recognize the importance of maintaining that Arctic 8 construct. And so I'm just hoping that that continues to advance in a positive way. There's some really, really wonderful work that's done focused on areas of mutual interest among the 8 Arctic states. And it's really important to maintain that type of cooperation based off of everything not military, right? So it's all around scientific research and sustainable economic development. But in the for the wildland fire issue in particular, the Arctic Council took that on under the Norwegians, and so that's something that they're really trying to help to address, both from a human security perspective, a science perspective, and then a policy coordination perspective. So I think it is encouraging to see that continuing. And then, when it comes to young people engaging in the Arctic world, we absolutely need that pipeline of expertise and talent coming into the Arctic space. I have a lot of empathy for students now because, we are in this world that is characterized by disruption. And it's really it's interesting being at Dartmouth now. I only work a little bit with students because most of my work is supporting some of the different contracts that we have with our allies and through State Department. But I really appreciate that work because I I recognize how challenging it is to be a student trying to figure out your career trajectory when this is not business as usual. This is not, what, your grandparents went through when considering a job, and just the level of disruption that is becoming the norm and that will be the norm. And it's really incumbent upon universities to to recognize the altered state of the world and to really reconsider what it means to prepare students. And I think this is, going back to what Zach was talking about with like the transdisciplinary science, we really need to be facilitating that kind of transdisciplinary thinking, systems thinking, because the world does exist in systems, not in silos. And then I guess just having personal like compassion for the challenges of navigating this as humans. It's I know there's so much pressure on students these days, and so just having that kind of ability to hold the fact that there are some really hard emotions that come with it, but we're in this together. And, I hope that through normalizing conversations and trying to think through these challenging decisions that we're trying to work through and then the problem sets that we're trying to deal with, that it can ultimately bring us together as a community of people who are a part of something that is much bigger than ourselves as individuals.
I think that's a great note to end on, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm gonna have to have this shirt made up, systems, not silos. I think that's great too. Thank you both. I really, really enjoyed this, and for everyone listening, as always, you can follow us on Apple, Spotify, and all the other major podcast platforms to not miss an episode. But thank you very much, both.